This is it. 4 months into his mandate, France's president putting it out there. Emmanuel Macron unveiling the big labor reform bill he promised on the campaign trail. Capping severance pay, reviewing collective bargaining deals, lowering payroll taxes, all part of his ambitions. And his bid, he says, to redress chronic unemployment that is double the rate of Germany or Britain. Macron knows that what happened the last time labor reform was introduced a year ago. His predecessor had to effectively bypass his own socialist majority in parliament to pass a watered-down version of a bill that in the end proved the final nail in the coffin of François Hollande's presidency. At least one union, the communist-aligned CGT, will be back on the streets next month against this latest reform. We're going to weigh the pros and cons of Macron's push to, as he put it, unbridle France's talent and energy. It begs the bigger question. What kind of reform do you need in a world where the job market's changing faster than lawmakers can write bills? What's best for young people? What's best for older workers and lower skilled employees? This in a world of growing automation, cross-border outsourcing. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what's being called Macron's moment of truth. With us, labor attorney Patrick Thiebart of the firm Janté Associates. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thanks as well to Denis Jacquet, founder of the Edu Factory, president of the Observatory for Uberization. In one word, what is that?
We work on everything that the digital change in the society in general, so the good aspects and the bad ones.
The good and the bad, which is what we'll be talking about, of course. Socialist Municipal Council for the City of Rouen, Laura Slimani.
Hi.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
And we want to welcome back as well Mark Dean, journalist at Bloomberg News. How are you?
Good.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. To think that Emmanuel Macron, 1 year ago, was François Hollande's economy minister when labor reform tore apart the left, yet he's back at it. Rochelle Harrison-Pless tells us what's on the table this time.
Overhauling France's labor laws. The government says the move will drive down unemployment, but critics say workers' rights are at risk. President Macron's ambitious reforms would make it easier to hire and fire employees. One key measure is the cap on compensation awarded by a labour court in the event of unfair dismissal. The payout would be 1 month's salary for every year of service up to 20 months, allowing companies to anticipate the cost of dismissing a worker. Cases taken to the labour court would go through more streamlined procedures and a shorter deadline for appeal. Downsizing would also be easier, thanks to changes in employment protection measures and the implementation of voluntary redundancy schemes. In exchange, the government has promised workers made redundant would receive a higher payout. The labour law revamp is the biggest and riskiest reform of Macron's fledgling presidency.
The biggest reform of Macron's presidency. Patrick Thiebart, how bold is this reform?
Well, I think it's a very important reform, and which was very expected by businesses, actually, because, as mentioned previously, the problem is decreasing the unemployment rate, which, as you know, is very high in France. And to do so, Macron's position is actually to give some security to employers to hire people. And one of this is definitely to cap
severance
the damages granted by labor courts, which I think is very important indeed.
So that is a big break with the past, if it's the case.
It is, because actually France was one of the very few European countries without any cap. And obviously the unions, as you may know, are very against the cap. But definitely, I think that we go to the normal path, which is again shared by most of the European member states.
Mark Dean, a little more than a decade ago, the German chancellor at the time, Gerhard Schroeder, he, at the time when Germany was considered the sick patient of Europe, perhaps an exaggeration, but nonetheless, the economy wasn't doing well, did a big labor reform as well. Can this be compared to what Schroeder did?
Look, I think it can be compared. It's, you know, we're not in the same time and place, so I think it's comparable. It's not the same. I think that.
How so?
sorry, it's just not the same. I think the Hartz IV reforms were harder. I think ultimately, but it was an easier time to be doing them because there was more uplift in the world economy. And Macron is coming in after, France has essentially been through 5 years of sort of the doldrums, fairly flat economic growth. And, Macron's a new presence. Schroeder, when he did this, was in his second term. He was more back against the wall type thing. And Macron has sort of had a surprise election victory, campaigned on this, and is absolutely, has a very clear strategy of how to put this all through.
How ambitious is it in your view?
I think it's reasonably ambitious, but I also don't, I think I object to the sort of portrayal of this in France sometimes as essentially Thatcherite. I think it's an important reform, and I think it makes, in many ways, a lot of sense. But let's not, I think one shouldn't exaggerate. We're not trying to turn France into 1980s Britain here.
Many, you agree?
I think, the way that you will appreciate or not the reform depends on what goal you think is a priority. And I think, you talked about employment rates, and I'd like to talk about poverty rates. France has a lower poverty rate than Germany and than many other countries in Europe. Also, we do have a lot of people who are unemployed. But I wouldn't like this reform, and I think that's what's going to happen. I wouldn't like this reform to lead to France having a higher employment rate, but also a higher poverty rate. I think people need jobs, but they need good jobs. So the question we have to ask ourselves, which is clearly not answered in this reform, is what is the kind of development model we want in a society where more jobs are being destroyed every day through automation, where digitalization is transforming massively the economy, and where clearly this reform is giving more leverage to employers to lay people off while knowing what it's going to cost them to lay people off for unreasonable motives. And that's worrying me, because I think it will be an opportunity for people to for employers to lay people off, and I don't see where it's going to allow them to employ more.
Patrick Thiebart, saying it will allow them to employ more, most notably severance pay.
I have somehow a difficulty understanding the logic that
employers saying
facilitate. We're going to.
Well, employers say they don't want to give people a full-time contract.
We're going to create jobs by facilitating layoffs. I mean, I think it's a bit of a contradictory logic. And this is what unions are saying. This is what a big part of the left will be saying, and this is why I'll be demonstrating against this reform.
Denis Jacquet?
I think at this time it's a small step for businesses, but a huge step for France, because most of the governments that we have had for the last maybe 30 years refuse to do anything about the labor laws in France. It was one of these taboo that we have in France, that immediately you have people in the streets and you should back off because it's nice. It's not nice to have all these people behind cameras at the 20h journal every day. So
the 8 o'clock news.
Yeah, it's very difficult. So for the first time, somebody has the guts to do something, which is very important, because what she just said is true and untrue. It's not the fact that you can lay off people that creates jobs. It's the fact that in France, 99% of the companies are under 250 employees, meaning that these people, most of them, 75% of them, they don't know how they will pay these people in the 45 coming days, not month, not year, not 45. That's the visibility that we have in terms of existing. I have been an entrepreneur for the last 25 years. Most of the time, when we know exactly what we will become in the 2 or 3 months, that's the maximum. It means that we have to be able to hire and lay off, depending on the revenues. Because at the end of the month, you can do and say whatever you want. But when you're the bank, you don't have the money to pay the people, that's the end of it.
Then you can lay people off. That's possible. You can lay people off if your company is not making enough money so that it's viable to employ that many people. So what is happening now is that it's true. It's going to give more leverage to employers to basically lay people off for reasons that do not justify such layoffs. It's going to allow them to relocate companies easily and more easily in different countries.
But,
I don't see how that's going to create jobs. I think that's a fantasy, and I think that's basically what the MEDEF, the big employers organization in France, has been putting in people's mind for the past 5 years, and they finally got it now. And just to say, it's not the first. I mean, I think that the reform that was also passed in the last mandate was actually quite ambitious, not in the sense that I would have liked it to be ambitious. So I'm not sure actually Macron is being very bold here. I just think he's going even further in the path that Hollande had been, that I also paradoxically had been fighting against, as a lot of the left.
The only thing where I would agree is that because of this split between large companies that we have 25 of the 500 largest companies in the world. These people doesn't need this kind of laws because they are destructing more jobs than they are creating. It has been like that for the last 15 years. So what I advised to Muriel Pénicaud when she came,
the labor minister,
but it was coming from the Élysée. I mean, all this reform and everything is coming from Macron and from the Élysée. Most of the ministers, they are doing now what Macron and the Élysée are saying. They don't have a large autonomy in their decisions. So I said, put this reform on the table and put it immediately and, exclusively for companies under 250
small and
employees, small and medium businesses. Because I don't know one entrepreneur that wants to lay off someone when he needs it. No. Most of the time, 90% of the case, he lay off somebody because he doesn't have a choice. So it's really fair. When you can't pay them, you have to lay them off because that's the only capability that you have to make sure that tomorrow or 2 days after, 1 month after, you will be able to create jobs again. So I would have loved this reform to be dedicated specifically to small and medium businesses.
All right, we've often asked on this very show, is France unreformable? Can you change the way things are? You were mentioning Denis, the labor minister. Let's listen to what she had to say. She said it's about changing the mindset of the country.
We're betting on the trust, the common intelligence of businesses, their employees, and their union representatives. It's not just about changing the labor code. I think what's at stake is changing the frame of mind of the labor code. And we'll know if we've succeeded if in coming years worker protection still exists and is adapted to the changing world, along with business freedom and initiative.
Earlier, Marc Dean was talking about the surprise election of Emmanuel Macron. You hear this talk about changing the mindset in France. Is France's mindset changing?
Well, I think it is. I think that over the past few years, we saw much more flexibility in the labor code. And by flexibility, I mean encouraging social partners to talk. France has been known, regrettably, for very hard fights between unions and patronat. And at the end of the day, this is very detrimental to the business. So what the law is indeed trying to set is a new spirit where negotiations at the company level becomes the common thing, which I think is very important indeed. Because if I may continue on this, because actually employees need to have the decision-making process taken at the level, not at the CBA, company bargaining, collective bargaining agreement level, and not at the law level. But on the other hand, when I look at the ordonnance, I don't believe that it's a break of the labor code. The law is still prevailing, and actually the CBAs have still many, many prerogatives, much more than really I could believe at the very beginning, I have to say, which I think is good. Look, the CDD, fixed-term employment
short-term contracts, yeah.
Indeed. Now, the temporary contracts are definitely the prerogatives of the CBAs, which I think is quite a good thing, because we don't want a labor code, as we say in French, à la carte. And this is not the path which is chosen, which I think is good.
Martine.
I think it's important to say that, this reform is not intended, again, to make France a completely wide open, Wild West sort of economy. And, it is definitely a flexibilization. And if you look at the reaction of the unions and of the business lobbies today, certainly the business lobbies are the most happy ones. But
That's a good indicator.
I think we should say it how it is.
Yeah.
Secondly, Mario Penico was talking about changing mentalities. I think this reform, first of all, it's not through yet. Okay, we're not. This hasn't happened
It's
yet.
day one, in fact.
It's sort of day one. Everyone expects, well, look, it's going to go through. There's not readiness for people to go in the streets. But politics is a funny business, and things can change very quickly. So let's wait and see. But I think Emmanuel Macron needs this to go through. His entire economic strategy rests on this because, first of all, the cyclical economic recovery that France is experiencing now, essentially 2 or 3 years behind the rest of the world, will be snuffed out immediately if it doesn't go through. The confidence which is shown, among business executives at the moment will be killed. And secondly, the other leg of Macron's strategy is to restore confidence at the European level in France's ability to manage its economy, and therefore change the wider economics of the Eurozone. And that also requires this reform to go through.
Yeah, I mean, I will agree in saying that I don't think it's a major and innovative reform, and I think it's a reform that stems from an ideology that was thriving in the 80s. Maybe it's not what Thatcher did, but it's inspired on neoliberalism, on what Thatcher did, on what Schröder did, on what Blair did afterwards, and it's much later now. And I think that it's in a way, I think this reform is already outdated because, again, the progressive reforms of today are reforms that take into account new kinds of diseases that result from work. For instance, burnouts, which are exploding, and when we do not have the tools today to face them and to allow people to be protected when they're faced with one. For instance, how do you take into account new kinds of pénibilité? I don't have the word of hardship of some professions compared to others. And the government actually went back on some of the progressive reforms that were taken. How do you today face automation? And I think that's impossible to do it without reducing working time. And I know it's a big debate, but it's a debate that Europe, like France and Europe, have to take on, because otherwise, we're going to just create more precariousness. Maybe businesses are going to still make money, but only the stakeholders and not the employees.
All right, we're going to pick up on these points. When we come back, stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Mark Dean here on set was billing it as, a moment of truth for the new French president, Emmanuel Macron, who has unveiled his big labor reform bill that he campaigned on when he was elected president back in May. With us to talk about it, labor attorney Patrick Thiebart of the firm Janté Associates. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Denis Jacquet, founder of the Edu Factory and president of the Observatory for Uberization. With us as well, socialist municipal councillor for the city of Rouen in Normandy, Laura Slimani, and Mark Dean, here present from Bloomberg News. In his first big interview since the summer, President Macron promising a revolution as big as when Copernicus wrote that the earth revolves around the sun. Here's what he had to say about France's labor market. The French system does a very good job of protecting insiders, those who have a stable contract. But the price is the complete exclusion of the others, the most young, the least qualified. Among Europe's big economies, only Italy and Spain have higher youth unemployment rates than France. There you see the trend over the last decade with France, roughly double the rate of that you'll find, for instance, in the United States and in Germany. What's your reaction when you look at that youth unemployment rate graph, Laura Slimani? Because the big criticism that's made is that young people are protesting in the streets, but the older ones have these rock-solid full-time contracts from which you're often virtually unfireable.
You mean young people have rock solid?
No, the older ones.
Well, like, first of all, that's not entirely true. It depends on what sections of society. A lot of women have very precarious contracts, whether they're young or old. So I think you can't generalize. And when you look at the employment rates in other countries, for instance, you also have to look at the precariousness levels, which are very high for young people. In France, it's true that young people are facing much higher unemployment rates, and it's more difficult for them to enter the labor market. And it's mostly also because we have a lack of jobs, and not necessarily because companies don't want to employ them, but because they just don't need to employ them for a lot of them, or they need to employ young people that don't have the qualifications that they are looking for. So that's an issue, but that's not going to be resolved by this reform at all.
Patrick Thiebart, last year when there were the big strikes, the young people, students, were among the most vocal in trying to protect the status quo.
Well, they were indeed. But let's be clear, most of the young people nowadays are hired through a fixed-term employment contract. And what is completely unacceptable is that fixed-term employment contracts become the norm in France. And actually, I would have understood your point if Macron had decided to be very kind with maybe le MEDEF and try to extend the fixed-term employment contracts, but actually the CDI, so the unlimited employment contract, yes, remains the norm. And so at the end of the day,
Yes,
the objective is to decrease the fixed-term employment contracts. And another thing which...
But you're making the long-term one much more precarious. So in the end, you're just transferring the precariousness from this one to the other, because you're making layoffs much easier. Because you're making it basically...
But it's not because you make layoff easier that it means that employers will lay off people.
But that's precisely the reason why
At the end of the day,
you argue that people don't employ people in indeterminate contracts, is because it's too much of an uncertainty. So what happens if you just make them them more flexible, and if you allow people to lay more people off? I mean, that's what's going to happen. It's a choice.
Yeah, but I can tell you, really, it's really based on my experience. I can tell you that some of my clients are telling me, I don't want to start business in France with unlimited employment contract. I want to start by fixed term. And definitely, this is not acceptable. So it seems to me that the job here is to give more security to employers so that they hire people and stop being anxious about going before a labor court.
In all of the countries where these reforms have taken place, this has led to more precariousness for everybody, including young people. In Germany, you have now you have a minimum wage, but for a long time you didn't even have a minimum wage. You had very, very precarious contracts. In the UK, you have these 0-hour contracts, which are also happening in Ireland. And these are mostly young people contracts. Now, how is that an improvement?
We don't have this. We don't have this.
There is an improvement in the fact that the unemployment rate is lower, and if you lose your job, you have a better chance of finding another one. I think that the precariousness...
No, not necessarily. If you lose your job, you might just not find one, because there isn't any. I mean...
Well, I think in Germany, if you live in Munich right now, you want a job, you find one, because unemployment rate is 4%.
You said it yourself, you can't compare the economic situation of Germany, which is at the middle of Europe, which has a huge industry, which has had a very clever industrial strategy for the past years, and which has a much lower demographic rates than France, that has an impact on the employment level of young people. And in France, we are also facing we have a high demographic.
So does the UK.
No, we have higher demographic rates than in the UK. Yes, we do.
All right, when it comes to temp workers without a long-term contract, French unions can point to numbers that show that, France is in the same league as Germany, middle of the pack when it comes to young people without a long-term work contract. It's particularly acute, this problem, by the way, in places like Italy and Spain. Lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate, Denis. One saying France will still have more protections for workers after this law than in the United States. But what we're hearing from this discussion is there's a lot of mistrust in this country.
Yeah, because most of the people see the French economy through the eyes and through the large companies. For a French guy, a typical French guy, when you speak about economy, when you speak about companies, he sees Total, BNP, the large company over 150,000 people. But he doesn't realize that the whole French economy relies on small and medium businesses. That's why the different comparison that we did have nothing to do. In the US, what I see, because I lived there for quite a long time, is that when you lose your job in 24 hours, the chances, at least for the last two years, is that you find another one the day after or 2 days after. So it doesn't work in France. Why don't we want to try something? If it doesn't work, okay, I will say I was wrong and we shouldn't have changed anything. But when you have a losing situation, and when we speak about poverty, I'm sorry, but the real poverty is when you don't have a job and you are unable to pay your bills at the end of the month. That's it.
Well, but you have a lot of people that have jobs and are unable to pay their bills at the end of the month in the US,
That's
for
not
instance.
the point of the labor law. The labor law is not to make sure that companies are able to pay much higher. At some point, when we say, okay, the price should be ever lower and lower and lower, we did that for 30 years with famous pouvoir d'achat, we call it in France.
Spending power.
That just push the jobs away from France, what we call the delocalization or this kind of stuff, outsourcing. And suddenly, 30 years after, we say, oh, too bad, the jobs are lost. So we are creating our own poverty. We have been doing that for 30 years, and nobody wants to change anything. That's crazy. When something is not working, you have to try something else. I'm not sure it will work, but we have to try to know. And all the discussions in France are, oh, we shouldn't do that, we shouldn't change because it will do that, do that. And most of us people that are speaking about this stuff have never worked in their life or never created a company in their life. So it's always funny, this kind of debates, because the only people that knows how the economy works are the entrepreneurs, and that's it.
Well, I mean, I think it's a bit hard on all the people that have a job every day and know what it is like to wake up in the morning, go to work and go back, and they're not entrepreneurs, they're just workers and they need their salary at the end of the month. I think they also understand how the economy works, and they also understand how it works for them and how it doesn't work for them when their salary, especially the ones who are on minimum wage, hasn't been raised in the past 5 years.
You just forget something.
This is just
the average salary of an entrepreneur in France is lower than the salary of an employee.
Yes, and they're also respectable people. But you have lots of people that know how the economy works and that are not entrepreneurs. I mean, I think it's very presumptuous for you to say this.
And the second thing that most of people like you, no offense, forget is that when you create a company, I started my first company, I was 27. You don't create it to create job. A company is not there to create job, and you don't owe jobs to anyone. The job is just a consequence of your growth, because you're successful, you have a good idea, you work hard, and suddenly you need people. That's it. You don't owe the job to anyone. And when you don't have any more money, any more revenue at the end of the month, and you cannot pay anything, you cannot pay it from your pocket. So that's the deal. That's how companies are working, and not in another way. That's the way it works. So I think we think that the job is granted. It's not granted. It's not granted for us entrepreneurs. It's
right.
not
Denis, you
granted
say
for
that, but
workers.
if you look in the
right.
past, oftentimes small businesses, especially in places outside of the big cities in France, the boss is sort of this. Oftentimes was a man, so it was kind of this patriarch who's supposed to look after his workers. There's this French way of thinking about what the role of the boss of a company is.
It's a difference. Me, on my side, most of the people that I hired become at some point shareholders of a company, because that's the way I want to do business. But that's not the way, and it's not the role of the labor law to decide what I should do and what my conscience should be. So that's the way I'm doing business. But that's something else. What I mean is that in a country where most of the companies are under 10 employees, there's no this kind of fight that is supposed to take place between a worker and an employer. We are all exactly in the same ship.
All right, long before the reform had been unveiled, the head of the communist-aligned CGT trade union had marked September 12th on the calendar. That's the day when rank and file, he says, should come out in force and march.
Nos craintes étaient fondées et c'est une loi.
Our fears were well founded. This is a law that will not fix the issue of unemployment. There is no link between labour rights and decreasing unemployment. It's a law that will favour big businesses, not small and medium businesses. So their logic here is that all workers are the problem, and no one is attacking stockholders, for example, who saw their revenues explode by 40 billion euros in the second quarter.
Les actionnaires, par exemple, qui viennent d'exploser leurs chiffres, 40 milliards d'euros au deuxième trimestre.
Mark Dean, you agree that this is a bill that favors big business, not small ones?
No, I think the biggest gains here are for small business. And if you look again at the reaction, the reaction from MEDEF, the big employers lobby here today, was very sort of tepid, calm, positive, but not jumping up and down. But if you look at the small business and the artisan representatives as they came out of the Prime Minister's meeting today, they had huge smiles on their faces and had to sort of constrain their ecstasy.
All right, there's a remark on the hashtag F24 debate. If only there was a union able to speak in the name of all the unemployed. I don't want to get too much into the inside baseball, but the trade unions in France are just splintered. There's a lot of them. It's not the same system as in Anglo-Saxon countries where you have one union per branch. The CGT is calling a march. Other unions are not. Some are still hesitating.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that unions are political in France. And I think that it's not particularly... I mean, the CGT's line has been clear and everyone's been expecting them to oppose it. That's fine. I think it's more interesting to look at what the CFDT said today and also the Force Ouvrière. Now, the FO is also a fairly radical union, and it is a little bit surprising that they're not at this stage deciding to participate in the protests.
Because people are saying this is going to be a sequel of last year. The people are going to come down in the streets, and that's going to be the end of Macron's reform.
Well, just that's it. But the other thing is to look at the CFDT today. Laurent Berger, the head of the CFDT union, was not as positive as some might have expected when he came out of the meeting. I think that the job of journalists, especially international journalists, on September 12th and 13th, is to report properly that the question is there are going to be protests. That's obviously true. This is France. And the question is always how widespread are the protests and is the political momentum with the unions who are protesting, is the movement spreading? And that is really the question that has to be answered on September 12th and September 23rd when Jean-Luc Mélenchon has organized protests.
Patrick Thibault, how do you gauge whether or not this reform will pass?
Well, first of all, I think that this law this reform is the result of roughly 100 meetings with unions and with association of employers. 100 and
on that point, by the way, it's a bit of speed dating because he was elected in May and they had to go fast.
Yeah, but look at what happened with the Loi Travail, Loi El Khomri. It was taken at the very end of the mandate of François Hollande. He was very weak. So actually, Macron is legitimate because he has just been elected. And actually, at the end of the day, I believe that this law is more or less what was in his program. So we should not be surprised by this. And the second thing is, you're right to say that most of the unions are relatively... they look at the law and they're not necessarily prepared to protest because this law is the result of negotiations. And Muriel Pénicaud said it's not necessarily the law that we would have agreed on if we don't have these meetings with the unions and association of employers. So I think it's relatively a well-balanced legislation, in my view.
But that's not something new. François Hollande, Emmanuel Macron's predecessor, he also had consultations with trade unions before he presented it.
You may recall that some unions said that there was a dignity of democracy, the democracy had not been respected because they were not completely consulted. Here, but
they just gave.
Yeah, but
they gave up their right to be consulted.
But I think you will agree with me to say that at this point in time, the unions have been consulted. So obviously, all their remarks have not been heard and not been taken into account. by the government, but it's probably true also for the MEDEF, for the Association of Employers.
If I could just interject quickly, François, to answer your question, how this compares to Hollande's Labour, the El Khomri reform. I mean, it's politics, politics, politics. That reform was neglected politically by François Hollande and Manuel Valls. It was coming in the wake of the Bataclan terrorist attacks in November 2015, and the political environment was not good for it to happen, and that's why essentially the protests against it were so strong.
Before we go, just one other point that was made in that interview in the news magazine Le Point. Emmanuel Macron talking a lot about revolution. He talked about revolution when it comes to temp workers, but also education. We're going to stop, for instance, making everyone believe that university studies are the solution for everyone. Free university education is in the Constitution, Denis Jacquet, but it's part of the conversation over what the workplace of tomorrow looks like. Do you agree with that statement?
It brings me. Oh, sorry, the jet lag is catching me. So it brings us to the discussion about digital and the changes that Laura was mentioning. So today is not because you are going to university, because we are a high level of education, that you will find a job. Now, because everything is changing so fast, we know that almost 40% of the jobs as we know them will disappear in the 5 to 10 coming years. We don't know the part of them that will
And it's those who are
mutate.
skilled who will adapt the best.
Yeah. And so how do you train people to jobs that don't exist and traditionally to jobs that will mutate and change in the 5 coming years? Take, for example, the accountants. We know that 35 to 40% of their jobs will change and disappear. We have to train them differently and not the way that university. So
well, but you can also change the way you train people in university.
So the priority should be done on
not allowing people
what
to
are
go
the
there.
jobs that are changing, how fast will they change, and what kind of program should we develop, redevelop,
So
and
Denis-
change to do it.
So Denis' point is, yes, train them, but not necessarily in a classic university.
Yeah, but the point is train them. And what Macron is saying here by basically comparing himself to someone who is revolutionary, I mean, I think the statement is actually not revolutionary at all. It's reactionary. It's basically saying, no, actually, let's not democratize university. Let's just keep a small elite in university and everyone can just go back to manual work. The problem is that, first of all, it's very unfair. And second of all, university and higher education and qualifications are still the best way to protect people from unemployment today. It's a reality. So we need people to be qualified and more people need to access qualifications because today the ones and the young people that are most faced with unemployment are the ones that have low or no qualifications.
But he isn't arguing against qualifications. He's arguing against university education. He's saying trade schools have offer opportunities as well. Germany does that much better.
Yeah, trade schools, you actually have to pay to go in them. So it's, again,
maybe
not
that's
very
something
fair.
to address, though.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure trade
That's
schools
not-
give jobs to everybody. I mean, they give jobs to everybody because
4%
there's not a
unemployment
lot
rate
of
in
them. So
Germany.
not a lot of them go there and only rich kids go there. So they have a lot of networks and then they find jobs. I mean, it's not that clear that there is a link. I mean, we can change the university system, but we shouldn't threaten higher education.
A final word on this, Patrick Thiebauer, as you look at the cases that you follow, how fast is the labor market changing, and when you look at the skills that are needed to match that changing labor market?
It's changing very, very quickly. And what is important, and I believe that we will agree on this idea, is that we need to give more training rights to employees. I think it is very, very important. I don't believe that this law is against that. On the contrary, it gives more training rights to employees because, for instance, when employees are made redundant, employers have the obligation to increase the training accounts of employees by 100 hours, which I think is very important. So nowadays, people need training at all the steps of their career, and we should not forget that.
All right, Patrick Thiebauer. It is always a learning curve here on the show. I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank as well Denis Jacquet, Martine, Laura Slimani. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, François.
So we've been told by the panel it's not going to be the sequel to the protests from the last labour reform. It could be something different.
One would hope. Let's just see how this is playing out in French media, because, of course, it is the big story on all of the news websites at the moment. Reform of the labour code, the ordonnance, and there are, is it 39 of them? So I won't go into the detail.
The way they're going to enact it is it's not exactly decrees. They're called ordinances, but it's a fast-track way of getting the legislation.
So there's a lot of detail in terms of the breakdown of these different ordonnances and decrees in the French media. International media looking at the situation from the outside are trying to simplify it. You have this headline in Politico.eu. Macron faces down a French sacred cow. In other words, I suppose, labour protection laws. Now, instead of 39 ordonnances that they're looking at, they have broken it down into 5 key points from Macron's big labour reform. So just to look at what some of those 5 points that they're breaking it down into: more emphasis on in-house labour talks as opposed to sector-level discussions. A firm's global economic health can be used to oppose plans to fire workers. A set scale for damages in the event of wrongful dismissal. Red tape being slashed for firms with more than 50 employees, and changes to short-term job contracts but not long-term job contracts. So that's Politico's, I think, quite successful attempt at simplifying what is quite a dense series of reforms.
Of course, if you want to simplify, really, I guess you could draw cartoons to explain it.
You could draw cartoons, you could indeed, and I'll get to them because we have quite a few. But just some of the elements of language that the talking points, if you like. The French Prime Minister has been talking about an ambitious, balanced, and fair set of labour reforms. So there's a real attempt here to spin what is happening positively, even if from the point of view of those who want to protect labour reform, obviously it's not positive from their point of view. Macron and the Prime Minister saying they don't want to really talk about reform, they want to talk about transformation. So it sounds better than reform, maybe. And this plays into as well Emmanuel Macron's talking points when he was in Bucharest last week, where he said France is an unreformable country, or any time France has been able to make reforms, it has avoided doing so. The French people detest reform. So there is this, from my point of view anyway, a clear attempt to say reform, bad, French people don't like reform, let's talk about transformation instead. In any case, this headline puts it quite clearly. French hate reform, but France will be transformed. You see the 2 words there in one headline. Now, in terms of how people are reacting on social media to all that, François, some are agreeing with him. Manu, clearly somebody speaking very informally here of Emmanuel Macron. Manu is so right when he says that the French detest reforms. So that's a French person agreeing, saying, yes, I detest reforms. And you can see that in some of the cartoons that are coming out up on social media today as well.
Okay, so that's the Labour Code.
That's it.
And this is social unrest.
Social unrest, and that is a match being lit to the social unrest. Ordonnance, by the way, is the top trending hashtag on French Twitter today. So for a topic that is somewhat dry, people are really taking an interest in this. That's the Labour Code as well, not being set on fire so much this time as being stabbed. So you can see that there's a lot of visual elements coming through here, and this picking up on
winter is coming. Hashtag ordonnance.
That's right.
Patrick Thiebart, as a Labour attorney, what do you think of the word ordonnance being the top hashtag on Twitter?
Well, I'm very happy about that because actually it gives some promotion to the fact that we try to make our legislation more flexible, which I think is very important. Mm-hmm. So I'm very happy about that.
Well, on that point, there are a lot of people also expressing that desire to see these reforms successfully implemented. And just to show you some of those comments also on social media, you have Neil saying, in a general way, these decrees, that make up the labour law reform seem positive, and we must adapt with the evolution of the workplace. Another person saying that, of course, we can't keep the same basis for, I suppose, the labour laws as we had 50 years ago. No one seems to want to understand this. So you have both points of view being expressed on social media, François. I'll finish with this tweet. Jason Omani, perhaps Irish, trying to sum all of this up. Macron learning that the French hate not reform, but all of their presidents, and so should just push through his reforms and let that be his legacy. Not sure. Is that a good way to end the segment? I'm not sure, but
it's pithy in any case.
It's condensed.
All right. Many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.